There we go. Curtis.
All right.
Good morning.
Good morning. Happy May 1st.
Yes.
Happy Labor Day.
Well, we're working hard today, huh?
Yeah.
Good to see you, Curtis.
Good to see you all. So I guess I should just jump right into this thing, huh?
Yep.
Okay. Hi. So look, as you guys know from the content of the last two talks, I've been doing a lot of work on World War I and the role of African-American soldiers. And I came across something in my research that I found really interesting. I discovered that in July of 1919, two deputies stood up on the floor of the Assemblée Nationale, and they condemned the treatment of Black soldiers by Black officers in France. And they spoke out about this on the floor of the Assemblée Nationale. And the Assemblée Nationale, all of the deputies unanimously reaffirmed the French position in terms of the droits de l'homme and condemned prejudice. And so, you know, this was in July of 1919, and in March I was doing some work, and I thought, you know what? It's almost July of 2019. That was 100 years ago. So I dashed off a letter to the president of the National Assembly, Richard Ferrand, which I have here. I wrote it in French, but I'll just quickly say, you know, I told him, I explained to him that I've been working on the role of Black soldiers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I came across this thing here that happened in 1919, and then I said to him, look, considering the fact that now today we're continued dealing with racism, anti-Semitism, and xenophobia in Europe, like as in the United States, I think this is a good moment for the Assemblée Nationale to recognize what you did 100 years ago. I sent this letter off on the 26th of March, 2019. 3 days later, I had in my mailbox, 3 days later, I had this in my mailbox, which was a response from the Assembly Nationale. It's unbelievable. And he says, following your letter to the President of the Assembly Nationale, I would love to meet you. Could you please call me? And he gives me his cell phone.
Oh.
He says, could you please call me, send me a mail as quickly as possible. So I contacted, this is the chef de cabinet for Richard Ferrand. I contacted him. We arranged a meeting. And when I arrived at the meeting, he had already put together a moquette of this brochure with this cover that says, without distinction of origin or color, the French deputies against segregation. And the back cover of it, it says, in France after the war in 1919, there was so much violence against Black soldiers by white soldiers that being fidèle to our universal tradition in France, the deputies voted unanimously this declaration on the 25th of July, 1919. The chamber, fidèle to the immortal principles that inspired the rights of man and citizen, speak out against and condemn all prejudice of religion, caste, or race, and affirm and proclaim the absolute equality of all men without distinction of origin of color, and the benefit of the protection of all the laws of our country. They printed this, and it was distributed on the 29th of July, 2019 to every deputy in the Assemblée Nationale. They put this poster up in the Assemblée Nationale, and this is in the bookshop. Okay, so that's the background of what I want to talk to you about, because I want to talk to you about the context, about what were they talking about, what was going on with the Americans here, and here it is. So I put together some notes, probably too many, but anyway, but what I did is I really borrowed very liberally from this great text by Jennifer D. Keene, Keene. I'll send this to you so you can add it to your collection in the library. It's called Doughboys, the Great War and the Remaking of America. And it's a really fascinating story of how this was created. You got that? Yeah. So this was a great resource for me. I've used this. This is another resource that I've used as well, The Unknown Soldiers.
Let's see, we have some problem with the light. Yeah, there we go. Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, The Unknown Soldiers. This is African-American Troops in World War I by Arthur Barbeau et Florette Henry. This is really good.
Curtis, you also sent us a link that the Washington Post had written an article.
Yeah, well, yeah, because this is one of the historians that I worked with, that we worked together on the exhibit at the National Museum of African American History and Culture that opened December 11th, and the Washington Post covered it.
Yeah. And that link I sent out yesterday when I was announcing once again the event today. And so if you want to go to that link, everybody, on the Washington Post, in the postcard from the library, you have a link.
Yeah, and it speaks of John Morrow, a great historian. I loved working with him. This is really the definitive history of the 15th Infantry Regiment. So those are my resources.
You were working for that exhibit. You were one of the roles playing.
Well, the role that I played, what happened was because of the work that I've been doing, Francois Hollande, when he was president, anticipating 1914 or 2014, put together a committee that was the umbrella committee for all of the activities around World War I, and it was headed up by Joseph Zimet. And so my project was I received the etiquette, j'étais labellisé by them. And then at a certain point, Zimet invited me to participate in the scientific committee, working with the Museum of African American History and Culture on the exhibit. And so that was my involvement.
Were you able to travel to Washington to go see?
Oh yeah. I went with I was part of the French delegation, so I went with Zimet to Washington. We went twice, and then I was there for the opening of the exhibit, and was invited to a reception at the home of the French ambassador to America, and he Etienne Philippe, I can't remember his name, but he wants to take this. His plan was for he was going to bring me back to Washington to go to the Congress and present this to the Congressional Black Congress. But COVID-19 put our plans off.
And the administration's there.
and the administration might not be all of that keen to this. This is my granddaughter.
Oh,
that's Marley. This is my Marley cup.
Cheers! Cheers!
Cheers. All right. Okay, so let me quickly, in the time, how much time you have to, because I haven't timed this, but I took some notes because I want you guys to know the background. Okay, so I'm just going to go into it. All right. So and you guys know this, we talked about this before, when the America entered the war in 1917, the federal government broke tradition and conscripted the majority of the forces they needed. Okay, they had done conscription before. They did it during the Civil War, but they had a different goal. Because during the Civil War, they drafted people to encourage guys who were reluctant to volunteer or re-enlist, to avoid the stigma. Being a conscript during the Civil War was a stigma, and so to avoid the stigma, people would join the army, and so only 8% of the troops were were recruited. But that narrative changed in 1914, 1918. America immediately embraced the draft as an honorable and an efficient way to raise an army. All right. So this is the first time 72% of the troops were drafted. Within 18 months, the army grew from roughly 128,000 regular active soldiers, 160,000 National Guardsmen, to about 3 million soldiers. There's a whole, it's incredible. There's another book I didn't use, but this you might want to read. This talks about how that happened. The great propaganda campaign that Wilson put together with an advertising guy creating a bureau of propaganda for America that was a model that was used by Goebbels in National Socialism. Anyway, all right. So here we are. We're drafting these guys, and now we're dealing with a couple of things. We're dealing with immigrants, okay, and so if you were an immigrant, you were drafted if you declared your intention to become a citizen. But a lot of immigrants didn't declare, either because they couldn't speak English or they didn't understand the law, and they found themselves in the army. And the army viewed immigrants through the same lens as civilians did, was with contempt. Okay, and it was the same thing with the idea of having Black soldiers. Okay. Civilian opinion on the importance of immigrant participation in the war affected the composition of the army. The idea is you had to be and show that you were 100% American in your views, and you had to completely walk away from any old world attributes to show that you fitted perfectly into this American concept. Okay. Now we're constructing a certain new narrative, a new aspect of the ideology of what it is to be an American, which is why so often, and I see this in my own family, my Marley's dad's dad is an Iranian immigrant. He came to America with the revolution in 1979. What's going on? You guys still see me? Can you hear me? I don't hear you. Nod your head if you hear me and I'll keep talking, because I don't see or hear anything. Zoom.
Just a second. Phoebe, are you sharing something? Are you trying to share a screen or something, Phoebe, or? Huh. I think we're having a problem maybe with Phoebe. She doesn't. Oh, Phoebe, you there? Phoebe? We seem to have. Phoebe, are you there? Yes. Are you trying to share something?
Sandrine, it looks like it's Jean-Claude who was sharing his screen. It must have been
Jean-Claude. Oh, okay. Please do not share anything. Please do not share anything with us.
Yeah, if it happens again, you can see the name at the top who is sharing.
Sorry,
at the top of your screen.
Okay. All right. Thank
you. Jean-Claude was up. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Sorry. So I turned my.
Back to
Sorry, Curtis.
Okay. All right. All right. So yeah. So as I was saying, so my son-in-law's father, their family, they're more, I mean, they are so American, and they're always questioning how can I possibly leave this great country to come and live in old Europe, this sort of thing. These are the kind of ideas that began to become inculcated in the whole American narrative that began in World War I. All right. As far as the Black soldiers are concerned, the general staff shared the civilian belief that segregation would preserve racial peace, and they never considered racially integrating individual units, okay? In fact, even though Army officials, both publicly and privately, had credited Black infantrymen with competent service in the Civil War, during the Indian Wars and the Spanish-American Wars along the Mexican borders. Consequently, the United States, they were preparing, as they had in previous wars, to train Black combat troops, okay? Black regular and National Guard companies quickly filled their enlistment quotas. The first mobilization plan that was approved by the General Staff, July 31st, 1917, suggested training the majority of Black draftees for combat. Woodrow Wilson had a completely different idea. As I told you guys in my last talk, I won't go through this all again. Wilson was a racist. Wilson resegregated Washington. Wilson had no desire at all to have Black troops see combat, and there were other senators who supported this. All right, so this Wilson and this political pressure, that's what I want to say, began to affect the General Staff's views on how to use these Black guys, okay? Communities across the South were opposed to the idea of having armed Black men among them. Both Mississippi, the senators from both Mississippi and Alabama appealed to the Secretary of War, as Newton Baker, to prevent Black soldiers from being housed in their states. There was a Mississippi senator, every old Black person knows about James V. Vardaman. He was an ardent opponent of the war, outspoken critic of the use of African-American soldiers. And he said, August 16, 1917, in a vitriolic address on the Senate floor, he said, under no circumstances could Black and white people live together on equal terms, and that the introduction of African-American servicemen to the South would inevitably lead to disaster. He went on to say, it is a lamentable fact, and one we should be prepared to meet, that one of the horrible problems which will grow out of this unfortunate war, which the Southern white people particularly must meet and overcome, is the training as a soldier which the Negro will receive. Impress the Negro with the fact that he is defending the flag, inflate his untutored soul with military airs, teach him that it is his duty to keep the emblem of the nation flying triumphantly in the air. It is but a short step to the conclusion that his political rights must be respected, even though it is necessary for him to give his life in defense of those rights. And you at once create a problem far-reaching and momentous in its character. And to complicate the role that racism played, white Southern planters opposed the drafting of African Americans because they say we're losing our labor force. And that the regions, because the region's agricultural economy, already destabilized by migration, northern migration, would be adversely affected by the removal of thousands of African Americans for military service, because coincidentally, as the war started in 1915, not connected to the war directly, began the largest migration of Blacks from the South to the North in American history. There were several million. By the time this great migration finished during World War II, millions of Blacks from the South had fled, oftentimes with just the shirts on their back, the violence, the rapes, the lynching that was going on. Plus, this coincided with the war. Immigrants are not coming over as laborers. So these guys were not only fleeing the South, they were fleeing into jobs in the North. And so this was having a powerful impact on agriculture in the South. They were losing their labor force. All right. But politicians like Vardaman, who voiced their opposition to compulsory military service for African Americans as an issue of regional safety, and other advocates conversely argued, this gets complicated, huh? Conversely argued that white men should not have to assume the burden of conscription while Black men remained at home. This was couched as a matter of principle, but also of regional safety, because Vardaman and others feared that the wives and daughters of white soldiers would be left vulnerable to the malingering Black men left behind. All right, so these are the complications in this discourse, all right? All right, So the Selective Service Act, they passed it on May 18th, 1917, and it required all men between the ages of 21 and 31 to register for the draft. 2,290,000 African Americans registered for the draft. Despite professing their commitment to racial equality, the Provost Marshal and those who devised the draft did not go so far as to institute a colorblind system. Here's what they did. They insisted that they carried out instructions that if a black person shows up at the draft, you have to tear off the bottom right-hand corner so that we know that it's the black person. So we know that they're not going to go into a combat unit, okay? All right, so the draft is underway. The War Department is now dealing with this influx of black guys deemed eligible for military service. What are we going to do with them? So on the 24th of August, 1917, Tasker Bliss, who was the Army Chief of Staff, submitted a memo to the Secretary of War, offering 6 potential plans, providing his opinion on the practicality of each one. He gave his personal endorsement to the final option, seen as the preferable plan with respect to the object of preventing racial trouble. It entailed, first, suspending the number of African American draftees. With a more limited pool, the Army would then begin to call these men out as they're required for service with the Quartermaster Corps and other labor organizations, providing them with preliminary instructions to the localities where they were raised, okay? When ready, they would be finally shipped abroad as rapidly as possible. The recommendation reflected a belief that just as in civilian life, black men, especially Southerners, were best suited for work that maximized their supposed natural physical abilities. Bliss and like-minded military officials also saw the employment of African American draftees for menial labor duties is the ideal way to both postpone addressing the use of black soldiers for combat service and avoid potential racial conflict. He fully appreciated Southern fears about giving black men training and handling firearms. He went on to say, he said, and this is behind a lot of this, huh? It's not so much, he said, it's not so much that they fear the Negro will strike if he gets a chance, but rather they assume with curious unanimity that he has every reason to strike, that any other person in his circumstances would rebel at the first moment. So obviously give these guys guns and they're gonna rebel against the white world. Now, okay, so there it is. We can't leave them behind because they're gonna ravage white women. We can't give them combat training because they'll learn how to use guns. We don't want them in the Army. What do we do with them? I mean, it's unbelievable. This conversation is going on and there's a war raging. All right. Now, by the time we get to the winter, this is insane. By the time we get to the winter of 1918, there's a new cry coming from the South. Kentucky Congressman Thomas, who claimed that the Negroes are permitted to stay home and hang around the town and steal, while white boys are taken from the farms and sent to the Army. So once again, the Army found itself under pressure to tailor its absorption of black draftees to satisfy the demands of white Southern civilians. This time, President Wilson just simply ordered the Army, look, create laboring units, whether we need them or not. And then now finally, the Army begins a full-scale induction of black troops, knowing that they're all going to go into laboring units. All right, it's insane. Okay, now,
Curtis, what's a laboring unit?
workers, labor, workers. Yeah. That means, and I'll get to what they'll be doing.
Washing dishes, things like that?
Washing dishes, building piers, whatever work needs to be done, okay? Now, you guys know, we've talked about W.E.B., you know W.E.B.'s boys, right? Okay, black intellectual, editor of the Crisis magazine. Now, Du Bois had high hopes for the impact that the war was going to have on black-white relations in America. It was his wish that in light of Black involvement with the armed services, white society would be more willing to integrate with Black populations, okay? So he famously wrote in Crisis magazine, which he was the editor for, he wrote an editorial and he wrote, quote, "This is the crisis of the world. We of the colored race have no ordinary interest in the outcome. That which the German power represents today spells death to the aspirations of Negroes and all darker races for equality, freedom, and democracy. Let us not hesitate." Earlier, he had called on Blacks to join and work in the fields and the factories so that the goal of world liberty might be realized. He said, "We must urge this. Despite our deep sympathy with the reasonable and deep-seated feeling of revolt among Negroes at the persistent insult and discrimination to which they are subject and will be subject, even when they do their patriotic duty, we must enter into this war." All right, that's Du Bois. All Black leaders weren't on the same page, all right? One guy, a clergyman in Washington, he paraphrased, and I don't know if you guys know that when it was during the Dred Scott Supreme Court decision, Justice Taney said, and Grimke paraphrases him, "Men of darker hue have no rights, which white men are bound to respect." All right, that was what Taney, when Dred Scott was trying to sue to be a citizen of America, that's when Taney and the Supreme Court said Black people could not be citizens of America, and this is before the 14th Amendment, and that no Black person had any right that any white person had any need to respect. Can you imagine? And so Grimke quotes, paraphrases that, and then continues to say, "And it is this narrow, contracted, contemptible, undemocratic idea of democracy that we have been fighting to make the world safe for, if we have been fighting to make it safe for democracy at all." He was against the war. And my hero, the great socialist A. Philip Randolph, who was the editor of The Messenger, which the FBI considered the most dangerous publication in America, he wrote that flag-waving leaders such as W.B. Du Bois should volunteer to go to France if they're so eager to make the world safe for democracy. We would rather fight to make Georgia safe for the Negro. And the Washington Post found it not surprising that whites feared a lack of loyalty among Black people whom they had disenfranchised and lynched. Okay, so there we are. Now we have Colonel Anderson, who's the operations of the operations branch of the War Plans Division. He's trying to deal with this issue, and he writes a memo May 16, 1918, and he says, "It would be of no use. It would be no use to exempt such men from the draft," speaking of Black people. "Such exempted men would be replaced by others of a similar kind, and the draft boards could run through the colored race in the United States and exempt a large part of them. In these days of conservation, when every rag and bone and tin is saved, human beings cannot be wasted. These colored men have to be inducted into the service by draft in their term, and it is believed that they ought to be put right to work, at useful work, which will be of real significance to the United States in prosecuting the war, and will release men for other services." All right, so almost all the Black draftees would serve in the military equivalent of chain gangs. In such capacity, Anderson asserted the Black soldier would cause no trouble, even in the South, and could be assigned to camps without outraging the racial sensitivity of Southerners. Each Southern state has Negroes in blue overalls working throughout the state with a pick and a shovel. That's what they will continue to do. And the first American troop convoy sailed for France before the end of June of 1917. There were no Black troops, but there were 400 or 500 Black stevedores. And I'm going to get to your question that you raised earlier, Phoebe. These Black stevedores, they were still technically civilians, but they were subject to military rule because their employees were under military contract, okay? They wore uniforms, surplus Union blues from the Civil War. They were sent to unload American ships as they arrived in France. Then the service of supplies, the SOS is what this laboring unit became known as, okay, battalion. They manned 3 divisions that supplied the front. The base sections, 9 in all, were areas surrounding the great ports. The last ones to be set up, number 9, was between Antwerp and Rotterdam, and they would serve American occupation troops in Germany after the armistice. Okay, here's what they did. They were responsible for building warehouses and sheds and supply dumps near the ports. They built the barracks at the bases. They built temporary housing. One of the worst details was the grave registration, where they had to find, record, and rebury the dead. And after the armistice, these guys were sent out into the battlefields to find dead bodies and bring them in and bury them. Okay, and it's interesting. This was also during the Great Flu epidemic, and the deaths from that were extraordinary. All right, how's our time? We okay? I'm almost done here.
You've got about 5 more minutes.
Oh, that's cool, because I've got my last paragraph here. All right, so by December of 1917, Black combat troops, which mostly meant previously organized National Guard units, the first one being the 15th, which we've talked about before, when they arrived, they were immediately set to work along with the SOS troops laying railroad tracks, all right? And so during the first 2 months of their arrivals, we have cables going back and forth between Pershing in France and General Bedell in Washington about what are we gonna do with these guys? We've got these Black combat troops who are the National Guardsmen, the 93rd coming over. Well, eventually, as you know, they were loaned to the 16th Division, 4th French Army under General Gouraud. All right, and I think I shared this with you last time. When they came, as my friends discovered, when they came, General Le Gallet, commander of the French 16th Division, sent out a memo. And he says, because the 15th is now renamed the 369th. And he wrote, as the 369th Regiment Infantry US comes to the front, the commanding general of the 16th Infantry Division wishes to bring the following points to the attention of the officers by way of their regional commanders. Number 1, example. We officers and men must at all times set the example for American troops, and especially for the 369th Regiment Infantry US, which is recruited among Blacks of New York. The example of bravery under fire, of discipline, of dress under fire or in camp, and this in our twofold quality as French and white who have been at war for 4 years. Let us not forget that the Black American soldiers will have to fight with their eyes on our soldiers, and that the devotion, affection, and even respect of these brave men, full of goodwill, depend on our attitude. Number 2, delicacy of sentiment. The Frenchman has a shortcoming. He is rebellious, mocking. We cannot hold our tongues, and we must always find a nickname for those who serve us or lead us. All the officers must convince their men that the Blacks of the 369th are not unfortunate Central African savages, but civilized men who live in one of the largest cities in the world, who are citizens of a country whose industrial enterprises of all kinds surpass all of our conceptions. It must not be forgotten that even though America entered the war to protect its own self-interest in preventing German world domination, it was guided above all by the very noble sentiment of high justice, affection for France, and contempt for the barbarity, bad faith, and monstrous impotence of the Germans. Number 3, conclusion. Let us treat the men of the 369th as good comrades and facilitate their task. We will thus gain their affection, their respect, and let us not forget that we need American steel and blood to chase out the invader and regain our lost provinces. The officers should communicate this memo to their men as soon as possible. So that's how these soldiers were received by the French and in French communities, et cetera, much to the chagrin of the Americans who were perplexed by this. And you know, the memo, which in fact, these guys the memo, not that one, but this memo that was sent out, and this is the last thing I'm going to say, was reprinted in the brochure for the French National Assembly to read in July. All right, what does this memo say? It says this really briefly. It is important that French officers selected to command Black American troops or to live in contact with them have an exact notion of the situation of Negroes in the United States. The considerations discussed in the following note thus should be communicated to them and widely disseminated. The French military authorities must even inform the French population of the camps of colored American troops about this subject through civilian authorities. The American point of view on the Negro question can appear debatable to many French minds, but it is not up to the French to discuss what some label prejudice. American opinion is unanimous on the Black question and admits no discussion. The elevated number of Negroes in the United States created for the white race of the Republic a danger of degeneration if an inexorable separation was not established between Blacks and whites. As this danger does not exist for the French race, the French public is accustomed to treating the Black familiarly and being very indulgent towards him. This indulgence and familiarity profoundly wound the Americans. They considered it an attack on their national dogmas. They fear that French contact will only inspire in Black Americans pretensions that they consider intolerable. Okay? It is indispensable that every effort be made to avoid profoundly alienating American opinion. Although a citizen of the United States, the colored man is considered by the white American as an inferior being with whom one can only have business or domestic service relations. They reproach him for a certain lack of intelligence, indiscretion, his lack of civic or professional consciousness, his familiarity. The Negro's vices are a constant danger for the American, who must severely repress them. For example, Black American troops in France have occasioned as many complaints for attempted rape as the entire rest of the army, although they've sent us soldiers only an elite from the physical and moral point of view, as the rejections and enlistment were enormous. Except, okay, so it goes on in conclusion, therefore, stop shaking their hands and hanging out with these people. Now, at the end of the war, there was there was one guy, Black guy, invited to participate in a wedding of a French family. They were walking from the mayor, from the city hall to the Zang to have a drink. A white military saw this and took his rifle and crashed the Black guy across his head for being with white people. What I learned reading this, I didn't know that according to these two deputies who brought this to the floor of the National Assembly, white officers were lynching Black guys in France. I had, in all of my research, I never came across that. Yeah. But so this is the background of the situation that led these two deputies to say this behavior of these white officers towards Black people is not acceptable in our country.
Those two deputies represented what area?
One of them, Achille René Boisneuf, was from Guadeloupe, and Le Grosselier was Martinique. Yeah. Okay, and so I'm translating this. I'll make sure that you have this in the library. I'm going to contact my guy at the National Assembly to make sure that the library has this. Voila.
So the African American soldiers were embraced by France, and France loved the culture that they were bringing. Can you talk about what happened when they first came off the boat here in France?
Yeah. You guys know what happened is
James. And then I'll turn it over to everybody else. You can ask questions, guys. Hold on.
James Reese Europe was the lieutenant in the 15th Infantry Regiment, 369th. He was America's most celebrated musician. He had an orchestra. When they came off the ship in Brest, January 1st, 1918, they lined up and they played the Marseillaise in ragtime. This led them on a tour. They went to Saint-Nazaire, they went to Nantes, they went to Angers, they went to Tours, they went to Moulins, they ended up in Aix-les-Bains, and this began a period. This is one of the things I write about in the catalog with the museum, what we call Paris Noir. This began this relationship because you see, this is a great question, because one of the things that happened is that Alain Locke, a Black philosopher, came to Paris in 1920. He wrote a book called The New Negro. He had taken that title from a discourse of A. Philip Randolph, who opposed the war. A. Philip Randolph was a socialist. He was a supporter of Eugene Debs. The only reason he didn't go to prison for speaking out against the war is because when they arrested him and took him to court, the judge did not believe that a Black person could be that elegant in the things that they accused him of saying. And so he was released. Honestly, racism saved him. But he created this concept of a new Negro. The new Negro for A. Philip Randolph was not someone who was going to be involved in this fight against American racism, but was somebody who was just going to stand up on their own, with their own culture, with their own, by their own means, and create their own way forward, but not be engaged in this W.E.B. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington dialectic about how to deal with the white race. Locke embraced that concept of a new Negro, but focused it culturally. And so the new Negro then became what launched what we call the Harlem Renaissance. This is that in the Harlem Renaissance, this begins right after World War I. This begins in 1920 in Harlem, and this brings forth the poets Countee Cullen, Zora Neale Hurston, Langston Hughes, who had been in France. So this whole powerful cultural movement comes together, and that cultural movement begins then a cultural exchange between Harlem and Paris.
Thank you, Curtis. I think we'll give some of the questions over to others. And just for those of you who have videos, the best thing to do is to do this because we see you on the screen. If you want to ask a question, you can open up your own mics, or Sandrina, you can open up their mics for them.
Jacqueline has a question.
You said it. Hello, thank you very much. That was very interesting.
Thank you, Jacqueline.
Maybe you said it, but what was the percentage, the ratio of Black people drafted?
Oh, yeah.
I heard the number 2 million.
Yeah, it was.
2 million registered for the draft. So those were Black and white people, the 2 million. Was it?
There were 2 million Black soldiers. There were 2 million Blacks drafted. Oh yeah. Now these soldiers.
2 million drafted.
Drafted. Not everybody that was drafted went to war.
Okay.
Not everybody who was drafted went to war.
Some of them stayed in the U.S.
Many of them stayed in the U.S. There was guard duty in the U.S. They tried to. The reason we had so many Black people in France, first of all, they needed laborers. So they brought guys to work. Yes. But before all of this had happened, Black National Guards units had formed, and they were combat trained, and they became integrated into the regular army. So these 2,000 from Harlem, these about 20,000 soldiers were in combat. Most of them in the 16th in the 4th French Army. So
I'm sorry.
When you see pictures, when you go on YouTube and you see pictures of Black soldiers with rifles, notice they're all wearing the casque Adrien.
Yes.
That means that they're not wearing the casque that Americans and British soldiers were wearing, but the casque Adrien, which means that whenever you see a Black soldier with a rifle, he's in a French unit.
Okay, thank you very much.
Welcome,
I'd like to just tell everybody that came in later, we're recording this video and we're going to be posting it on YouTube. When you joined us, we automatically turned off your videos. If you're welcome to turn them back on, but we will be posting it and it'll become public. So those of you who have videos off, you can turn them on if you want to. Just know that it's going to be posted on the public. Anybody else questions? Eve. Hi.
Yes.
Good morning, Eve. We're turning on your.
Yes.
Yeah.
What were the number of fatalities among the black soldiers?
Eve, I will tell you in just a second. John Morrow we have a whole list of them.
Are you going to read every name?
No. No, I'm not gonna. Do you know what? It's going to take me a moment to find that number. Here's what I'm going to do, Eve. I'll find a number and I'll send it to Phoebe.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. And Phoebe will let you know. All right.
Yes. Regard with the fatalities of white soldiers.
Voila. I will send that to Phoebe.
Can I ask a question?
By all means, sir.
Yeah, my name's Tony. You said that the Mississippi and the Alabama senators were against the black people going to fight in the war.
Yes.
Could you tell me whether they were? This really isn't so much about the participation of the soldiers. It's more a question about if they were white or black senators from those two states. Could you say when were black people allowed to serve as senators in the administration of America?
Black people, that's a great question, Eve. There was a period after the Civil War between 1865 and 1879 that was known as Reconstruction. It was a project that Lincoln had put together anticipating the end of the Civil War to reconstruct the South. Lincoln was assassinated 3 days after, so he didn't get a chance to administer this, but it went forward anyway. And during Reconstruction, between 1865 and 1879, there were black senators, congressmen, local school board, et cetera, et cetera. The governor of Louisiana was black, as well as the governor of North Carolina during Reconstruction. This came to an end in 1879 with the election of Rutherford B. Hayes. And the next time black people served in the government as elected officials would be when Congressman Dawson or Adam Clayton Powell Sr. from New York were elected to Congress in 1935, I believe.
All right. Yes. Right.
All right.
Okay. So when was it generally accepted then that the black people could become active soldiers?
At the end of World War II, in 1947, A. Philip Randolph, the man who I mentioned earlier, who was against the war, went to Washington and met with Harry Truman and encouraged Harry Truman to integrate the American military forces.
Right.
And so it was 1947 that the American military became integrated. And
Right.
of course, by the time we get to the Vietnam War, black soldiers become cannon fodder.
Yeah.
We can't get enough black soldiers for Vietnam.
Yeah, okay, yeah, because I've been watching some interesting programs on the Vietnam War just recently on the television, watching too much television. I've got one other question for you. When the French officers were, they took charge of the black Americans.
Yeah.
Was there a language barrier? You know, were there many people able to speak French? Or
there was a language barrier. There was one black officer who was fluent in French that I know of, but absolutely there was a language. Look, there was that's a great question, Eve, because interestingly enough, a lot of Largo started during World War I because there was a language barrier among the French. There were the soldiers from Languedoc, from different Brittany, from Picardy, and they all spoke their whatever Normandy. They all spoke the dialect that they spoke, and so a lot of l'argot began. Slang began among the soldiers. It became diffused in the French language out of World War I, and so a lot of the African American soldiers were engaged in that as well. So absolutely, there were language, but they communicated very well over wine.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome, Eve.
Anybody else? Yes.
Eve, yeah.
Yes, please. What happened with the black soldiers when they came home in US?
When the black soldiers came home from the US, I'm working on that right now. We have a period that is known as Red Summer. And it's Red Summer because of the amount of riots and deaths. Black soldiers were first encouraged not to wear their uniforms when they went back home because white people did not want to see black people wearing the uniform of the country. Black men were pulled from buses and lynched because they were wearing the uniform. There were riots. One of the most horrible riots happened in El Paso, where there was a very wealthy black community, and the whites somehow got a hold of military airplanes from World War I and bombed, not El Paso, Tulsa, Oklahoma, and bombed. Can you imagine? Flew over Tulsa, Oklahoma with World War I airplanes and bombed the community, completely destroyed the community. One of the places where there were these riots was East St. Louis, where a young girl saw her father's friend stabbed in the neck, where people saw pregnant women murdered in the streets. And this little girl decided that when she grew up, she was going to leave America, never to come back to it again. She became an entertainer. Her name is Josephine Baker. That's what encouraged Josephine Baker to seeing the riots. It was what happened at the end of World War I was unbelievable.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Good question.
You're welcome
Yeah,
to
with
ask
Jill.
questions in French if that's easier.
Yeah, that's Jill.
Well, hi.
Hello, Jill.
Hello. This has been really interesting. You may well have answered this. I have bad memory retention, but was there ever a formal apology by the U.S. government for?
Never.
Oh.
The closest that it came was there was because the story was that the black soldiers who were in combat were cowards and they ran away from battle, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there was a very important moment where two black soldiers, Johnson and Roberts, held off a German group that was trying to invade a camp, and they were not recognized for what they had done until 2009 or 10. I think Obama posthumously gave Johnson the Medal of Honor, and there was another heroic soldier that George Bush gave the Medal of Honor to during his administration. But none of these soldiers received none of them received a Purple Heart, nothing. And there's an apology, no, never.
So it was just two individuals who were
nominally
apologized to.
There were two who were posthumously honored for the work that they did. Both of them received posthumously the Medal of Honor, and that was this century, not during the century even in which they lived.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
Yeah, one more question. We have time, and then
We have Leah. I think Leah, right? Okay.
Hi, Leah.
Hi, I wanted to know about, I know some black soldiers, I totally imagine black soldiers died during the war, okay. But how was it with their families? How did they do? Because I guess they were alone with a wife, with children.
Yeah. Yeah, there were, we have letters where the reason we know a lot of what was going on, the behavior towards them is because we have letters that they wrote home to their mothers, to their wives. One of the things that happened was, it's really interesting, they were not only talking about the maltreatment that they were receiving from the military officials, but the thing that surprised these people, imagine, Leah, imagine these guys, they were 16, 17, 18 years old when they were drafted into the army. They had fled from the South. If they looked at a white person, they could be killed. They could, if they showed any sign of any, if they didn't take off their hat or lower their eyes and this sort of thing, they would lose their lives. Now they arrive in a country where people are saying, hey, we're glad to see you. Come on in, have a drink, be part of our family, et cetera, et cetera. So they're writing home, telling people, we are in a country where people actually treat us like human beings. And so the story of France began to diffuse. When I was a kid, I had this great love for France that I had no idea where it came from. It was just in the air in the Black community that France was a place of freedom and liberty and respect and et cetera, et cetera. So we had these two conversations going on. One, they were writing letters saying how horribly they were treated. We can't wait until we get out of the army. The other one's, it's amazing how human these people are. So that created this kind of connection between Black America and France that exists until today, and until today, much to the chagrin of Southern whites. That's a whole nother talk. That's another book.
Curtis, thank you for this wonderful message of friendship with France and the United States in these hard times. It warms our hearts, and wonderful to have you share.
Thank you.
Very, very, yep, hand up, round of applause.
To you guys, and thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me. I feel like, I don't know, I feel such a part of your community. I really do. I feel a part of your community. I feel a part of your library. It's so funny. I can't remember who it was. I was in America for Christmas. And when I returned to France.
Turn on your microphone, Andy.
Where is she?
It was me.
There you are. Yes. It was so crazy. I'm standing online at the douane to show my passport. I think I have two people in front of me, and somebody taps me on my shoulder. There you were.
7 o'clock in the morning on January 1st.
January 1st is time to go.
We both flew over New Year's. Curtis didn't know that he had a fan club and he had a following. Soon people will be asking for your autograph at the airport. You have to be careful.
It's a mutual fan club.
Oh.
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah. So I'm just, you know, when Robert and Annette suggested this, I didn't hesitate to say yes, of course. I don't know what I'll talk about. I'll make up something, but yeah.
Well, Curtis, you're definitely a part of our community, and thank you for coming back. And
thank you, Curtis.
Thank you guys so much. Thank you.
Being with us this morning.
Stay safe. Stay safe. Stay inside. Keep a distance. Wash your hands. Look after yourselves. Okay.
Curtis, we'll bring you back. Stay on the screen here. A couple of announcements. We have another lockdown lecture next week. This will be very different. This is from the Labour's deputy leader in the House of the Lords in England, in Great Britain. And her name is Diane Hayter, yeah. And she's going to be talking about Brexit, which is another interesting and complex situation that we're handling right now. So that's our announcement. That'll be next week on the 8th of May at 10:30. It's the same link, and the link is up on our website if you can't remember the link. Thank you for coming. We have decided for opening the library. I don't know if you saw in our email yesterday, we're going to be opening for circulation for books during restricted hours. Those hours are up on our website. If you want books from the library, what would be best is to look at our catalog and determine which books you would like so we can pull them from the shelves. We're not going to let you in beyond the front desk. You can go up to the front desk, return books, borrow books, and that's it for the moment. We're starting keeping everybody safe. It's our focus right now. So that'll be for the month of May, June, and July. Activities during the month of May will not happen in the library, so you're welcome to join different things on Zoom. We're running all sorts of different things, so that's the news about that. I'd like to thank our staff members and Anne LeBugle, who's our chairwoman. We've been working hard and trying to bring things to you and connecting. I think that's, I'd like to thank Sandrine once again.
You're welcome.
We're going to be checking you out of, Curtis, you stay on the screen because we're going to be talking to you just so stay with us. And anything to add? I don't think so. Another round of applause for Curtis.
Thank you all so much.
Have a great day, guys. Take care, like Curtis says, you know. And we'll see you soon. Yes, we have some
Lily of the Valley, yeah. So you guys can leave the room by yourself, or if you don't know how to do it, I'll just kick you out.
See you soon, guys. Thanks for coming. Have a great day. Yeah, so Curtis, stay on the screen. We'll be with you in a second. Nice to see you, Gail. Oops. Bye, boy.
Hi, Phoebe, how are you?
Take care.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Nice seeing you guys.
How are you?
Fine, we're fine.
Doing great.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Ciao.
Okay, do you want me to stay, Phoebe?
Yeah, I'll hang out.
All right.
Thank you, Curtis.
You're welcome. Thank you so much. It was a
It's
pleasure.
still recording, Phoebe.
Oh, right. Oh. Okay, hold on a second.
You want me to do it?